Rishi Sunak is set to become the next UK Prime Minister. His contender, Penny Mordaunt, dropped out of the Tory leadership race, announcing there was just one person with the backing of 100 MPs. The 1922 committee chairman, Graham Brady, confirmed Rishi Sunak is the new Tory leader. While backing out, Penny Mordaunt said she's proud of her campaign. She calls the decision historic, adding that Rishi Sunak has her full support. According to reports, it's expected Rishi Sunak to formally become Prime Minister tomorrow. The ex-chancellor gained the support of well over half of Tory MPs. With Mordaunt struggling to reach the 100 MP threshold, Rishi Sunak will become the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister. Now, for more on this, we are joined by Mike Buckley, who's a political analyst and senior journalist who joins us live from London. Mike, if we can just start off with you, what is the significance of this announcement that Rishi Sunak is to take the keys at number 10?
Well, I think those of us who live our lives in the United Kingdom are hoping that it means a return to competent government. We haven't had a functional government in our country for about a year because Boris Johnson, the last but one Prime Minister, was mired in so many scandals, which some of your listeners or viewers may have heard about. Primarily, the fact that he broke rules during the COVID-19 lockdowns, which he was asking the rest of us to obey. But there were many other scandals as well, which involving money, involving MPs doing the wrong thing and mistreating their staff, and involving Boris Johnson lying to the Parliament and lying to the country. So that was a mess, and we didn't have functional government during that time, really. We've then had about 6 weeks of Liz Truss, another Prime Minister who's been even worse. So we're now hoping that Rishi Sunak will bring some competence back to proceedings. And that matters because our economy is in a mess. It matters because inflation is very high. It matters because mortgages are going up. It matters because actually a lot of people in the UK now, even though we're a rich country, can't afford to pay their fuel bills and they can't afford to feed their families. And we have many public services, including our health service, which are now struggling very much. And that's because we've had 12 years of bad government, as I would say, under the Conservative Party, but it's just getting worse and worse. So I do hope that Rishi Sunak can begin to turn things around.
Mike, you outlined there a myriad of factors that Rishi Sunak will be facing and facing imminently, these pressing issues. What are we expecting of his policies, and will it help ease some of the huge amounts of tension and concern that has really embroiled British politics in recent weeks?
Well, the last 6 weeks have done... we were in a difficult state 6 weeks ago. We're in a much more difficult position now because, as you may know, the last Prime Minister, Liz Truss, she put a budget through, a financial statement, and the financial markets were very unhappy with. And as a result, the value of the pound fell, the value of government bonds fell as well. And the result of that is that interest rates have gone up and inflation has also gone up. And that has meant that our government is going to have to pay a lot more money to service its borrowing. That means that overall they've got less money to spend, which means that we're going to have even more government cuts. So we've got public services, as I say, including the health service, but not just the health service, also education, also the police, also other services that are in real difficulty. And as a result, they can't really take more cuts without it impacting people's lives and indeed costing lives in the health service, but also making life more difficult elsewhere in society. So this impacts on real people's lives. This isn't a political story. It's a story that affects real people, primarily the people at the bottom of the pile here in the UK, who were already having a hard time and will now have an even harder time because to balance the government books, Rishi Sunak is going to have to cut spending and put up taxes.
And how much of a surprise, Mike, is it that we've seen such an escalation this Monday with Penny Mordaunt dropping out of the race? Was that expected? Of course, we had Boris Johnson announcing he wouldn't be running this time around. How much of a surprise is it that we can see that Rishi Sunak will be taking the keys to number 10 earlier than perhaps some thought? Of course, it was expected that we might have to wait till the end of the week for a decision to be made.
Well, I think it's a relief to a lot of people because if we'd had to wait to the end of the week, that would have meant that the vote would have gone to Conservative Party members, about 180,000 people who would have then chosen the next Prime Minister. And these people are very right-wing. So they don't represent, society as a whole. And so it's a very unfair way to choose the next prime minister, really, a very undemocratic way. I mean, arguably the way that it's been done with just Conservative Party MPs choosing the next prime minister was actually more democratic, because at least they've all been voted for, by the electorate at large. So it's a little bit more democratic, even though it may still seem like a strange way to do things to your viewers or your listeners. But also it means that we now get certainty on Monday rather than certainty on Friday. I'm no fan of Rishi Sunak. I don't think he's very well intentioned towards the majority of people in this country. I think he's very right wing. I don't think he believes that government can be a force for good, for example. And I don't think he's very strong on very important issues like climate change. But I do think that he's much more competent than Boris Johnson, and probably than Penny Mordaunt as well. And in the end, Boris Johnson needed 100 MPs to get onto the ballot to have a chance to enter the contest, and he didn't manage to get 100 MPs, and neither did Penny Mordaunt. So in the end, the Conservative Party chose Rishi Sunak to be the Prime Minister, and it's likely now that he will be the Prime Minister for the next 2 years until we get a general election.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for your analysis. That was Mike Buckley speaking to us from London. We're going to bring in a writer and political commentator, Adam Schwartz, who's also joining us now. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time. First of all, just piggybacking on that discussion, obviously, we've heard vehemently over recent weeks from Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, who's saying that there must be a general election. Are those calls expected to amplify, and just how much of a battle will Rishi Sunak be facing when it comes to that issue of a mandate for him to govern?
Well, I think there's really two major issues of sort of democratic legitimacy that Sunak will have. Firstly is the fact that, of course, he was not directly elected by the British electorate. He was just elected by British MPs, despite the fact that they, of course, were elected themselves. And, the fact that for the second time mid-electoral cycle, you've had someone who wasn't chosen by the people, of course, has major questions of legitimacy. But, of course, we do live in a parliamentary democracy here in the UK rather than a presidential system, which does mean that actually it is a little bit different in terms of where you draw your authority from. I think the second issue to do with democratic legitimacy is actually the fact that the issues that were fought over during the December 2019 election, namely Brexit and levelling up, just seems so far detached from so many of the issues that we're currently facing now, whether that's the economic fallout from the war in Ukraine, or whether the major issues to do with standards in democracy, which really means that actually, the things that politicians were elected to do 2.5 years ago seem so different from the issues and the challenges that politicians are facing now. So I think there are two main reasons why Sunak will have an issue in terms of his legitimacy. I would very much expect, actually, for as long as this parliament remains, for that to be a major attack line from not only the opposition Labour Party, but also the Liberal Democrats as well. Though, of course, that may well change if we see a drastic change in the opinion polls, and let's say Sunak manages to recover and get the Conservative Party into a decent place in terms of polling. So I think it's something they will continue to talk about, very much in the way that the Labour Party continued to talk about Theresa May's lack of democratic legitimacy when she was elected in 2016, which ultimately led to Theresa May going to the electorate 3 years early and having this disastrous result of her losing a majority. And I think because of that very recent history of the Conservative Party going to an election, mid-election cycle, Sunak will be very worried about, going to the electorate before he actually needs to. And, he's got still a pretty decent majority of about 60 to 70 MPs. So really, there's no reason for him to do so. However, if we do see major deterioration of the economic situation in the UK, potentially some kind of civil disorder, then I think it would be quite difficult for Sunak to present himself as someone who has continued authority to rule without an election.
Adam, thank you very much. Well, Adam, thank you very much for sharing your analysis and insight. That was Adam Schwartz, the writer and political commentator. We're now going to bring in our correspondent, Alice Isaac, who is on the ground as well. Alice, just what kind of a reaction can we expect from the British public to this announcement that Rishi Sunak will be the next Prime Minister?
think there's going to be quite a bit of relief actually from the UK public. They want some stability, they want some economic stability, they want some answers. We're heading into a very bleak winter. We've got a cost of living crisis, there's food distribution issues, there's also, we've got to think about costs of bills going up, we've still got the war in Ukraine. So there's lots of things that we are facing as a UK public, and so they do want someone that is stable. And honestly, it did seem that there was constant backstabbing and pettiness within the Tory parties that now hopefully will be at least over for the short term, which can answer some of those questions about what policy is going to be put forward, whether we'll see inflation rise again, whether the pound will stabilise. So that will all help now that we've got somebody who will hopefully lead and take charge and give us some of those answers that we are asking for. So when Boris Johnson was put about as a potential next candidate, the former Prime Minister was welcomed in some areas of the UK as the person that could lead the country, because a lot of people said that they trust him despite when he was in power, that he had a really quite terrible polling rate itself. So now we've got Rishi Sunak. The Conservative Party really needs someone to help build them up and boost them, and they need someone to fight for the country now.
And Alice, just how much of a departure will we expect from Rishi Sunak, his policies, his politics, from his predecessors Liz Truss and even Boris Johnson before him?
Of course, he was a chancellor when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, so we can't expect him to be really that much different to some of those policies. Although Boris Johnson himself was very much a type of have your cake and eat it person, to keep trying to get capitalism into the country, whereas Rishi Sunak is trying to make sure that we are more economically stable. It's what he was talking about and pushing throughout those hustings. Liz Truss wanted the growth, and was willing to borrow extortionate amounts, and she hadn't quite clarified where that money was going to be coming from. So now that Rishi Sunak is in charge, he will be able to talk about those policies that he did mention back in the hustings. He wants to try and pay off some of the COVID furlough debt that we had built up over the last couple of years. He was looking into interest rates and inflation rates as well. I don't think that we're going to be seeing a huge benefit into the purse. It's unlikely that we will be seeing a lot more money in people's wages, and we are going to be still seeing the effects of that war in Ukraine, and also the distribution of food issues that we are still facing, and the cost of living crisis continues as we still see rising costs in our energy bills. But it's likely that he will keep that price cap that Liz Truss put in place. National insurance, that's already gone through legislation, as has the housing, some of the housing changes that Liz Truss had made. So what we are looking for now is who's going to be his chancellor, what he's going to be pushing through. It's likely that Jeremy Hunt may still be the person that takes on that role. And what he wanted was to try and get a bit more stability, trying to figure out how we can patch some of those huge, hefty borrowing costs that we have been borrowing over and over for the last few years, not even just in the time that Liz Truss was there. So I think what Rishi Sunak will be bringing is some economic stability, and we've seen that the markets are less spooked now that he is in charge.
Well, Alice, thank you very much for the latest. Of course, we'll be very much looking for more signs of that, whether the Tories will be able to bring in some stability after a tumultuous few weeks. That was Alice Isaac, our correspondent in London.